1945. A city surrounded on all sides. A dictator hiding in an underground bunker while his empire collapses meters above his head. Child soldiers and old men thrown onto the front lines as the last, desperate defense of a regime already dead in every way but name. This is the Battle of Berlin, the final, catastrophic collapse of Nazi Germany and one of the bloodiest urban battles ever fought. In just over 2 weeks of fighting, hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians died, a city was reduced to rubble, and the man responsible for one of history's greatest atrocities took his own life, rather than face the consequences of what he had unleashed on the world. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and drop a like if you want more deep dives into the most dramatic final chapters of military history. And I genuinely want to know, where in the world are you watching this from tonight? Drop your country in the comments, I read every single one. Let's rewind to early 1945, when Nazi Germany's collapse had become not a question of if, but simply of when. By early 1945, Nazi Germany was already crumbling on every front. In the west, American, British, and French forces had crossed the Rhine River and were advancing steadily into the German heartland. In the east, the Soviet Red Army, having already pushed the Germans back from the gates of Moscow and Stalingrad years earlier, was now advancing relentlessly through Poland and into German territory itself, exacting brutal revenge for the horrors inflicted upon their own country during the earlier German invasion. Adolf Hitler, increasingly detached from military reality and refusing to accept the scale of the disaster unfolding around him, retreated into a deep underground bunker complex beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. From this bunker he continued issuing orders to armies that, in many cases, no longer existed in any meaningful fighting capacity. By mid-April 1945, Soviet forces under commanders Georgy Zhukov and Konev had assembled a staggering force of over 2.5 million soldiers, thousands of tanks, and tens of thousands of artillery pieces, all converging on the German capital in a final, overwhelming push. German defenses around Berlin, by contrast, were a patchwork of exhausted regular army units, poorly trained Volkssturm militia made up of old men and teenage boys, and remaining SS units determined to fight to the bitter end regardless of the hopeless odds stacked against them. The Soviet offensive against Berlin officially began on April 16, 1945, with a massive artillery bombardment and assault across the Seelow Heights, a heavily fortified ridgeline that formed the last major defensive barrier protecting the approach to Berlin itself. The fighting at Seelow Heights was brutal and costly for the attacking Soviet forces, as German defenders, despite being badly outnumbered, used the elevated terrain and prepared fortifications to inflict heavy casualties over several days of intense combat. Soviet commanders, under enormous pressure to capture Berlin before their Western Allied counterparts could arrive, pushed their exhausted troops forward with little regard for the mounting losses. By April 19, German defenses at Seelow finally collapsed under the sheer weight of Soviet numbers and firepower, opening the direct road to Berlin itself. Within days, Soviet forces had encircled the city entirely, cutting off any possibility of escape or reinforcement for the German defenders trapped inside. Inside Berlin, panic and desperation spread rapidly among both civilians and the remaining military garrison. Refugees flooded into the city center seeking safety that simply did not exist anywhere within its boundaries. Meanwhile, Hitler continued to issue increasingly delusional orders, commanding phantom armies to counterattack and relieve the city, forces that, in reality, had either been destroyed weeks earlier or existed only on paper in his increasingly disconnected mind. If this desperate collapse is gripping you already, make sure to smash that like button. It genuinely helps this video reach more curious minds. Once Soviet forces breached the outer defenses of Berlin itself, the battle transformed into brutal, grinding urban combat, fought street by street and building by building across the ruined city. German defenders, though hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned, used the rubble-strewn streets and shattered buildings to their tactical advantage, turning basements, sewers, and subway tunnels into makeshift defensive positions. Soviet tanks proved dangerously vulnerable in these tight urban conditions, easily ambushed by German soldiers wielding handheld anti-tank weapons from close range, resulting in staggering tank losses for the advancing Red Army throughout the battle. Soviet commanders adapted quickly, forming small combined infantry and armor assault groups specifically designed to clear buildings and neutralize these ambush positions, one block at a time. Civilians trapped within the city endured absolutely horrific conditions throughout the battle, sheltering in basements and subway tunnels while artillery shells rained down relentlessly overhead. Food and clean water became increasingly scarce as the fighting dragged on. Soviet soldiers, fueled partly by years of pent-up rage over German atrocities committed in their own homeland, committed widespread and horrific violence against German civilians during the final capture of the city. a dark and often uncomfortable chapter of the battle's aftermath. By April 30th, Soviet forces had fought their way to within a few blocks of the Reich Chancellery itself, placing them almost directly above Hitler's underground bunker. Deep within his bunker, Hitler had finally been forced to confront the undeniable reality that Berlin, and Nazi Germany along with it, was about to fall completely. On April 29, 1945, he married his longtime companion Eva Braun in a brief ceremony held within the bunker itself. He also dictated his final political testament, blaming Jewish people and his own generals for Germany's catastrophic defeat, refusing until his last moments to accept any personal responsibility for the horrors he had unleashed upon the world. On April 30, 1945, with Soviet forces fighting just streets away from the bunker entrance, Adolf Hitler took his own life, along with Eva Braun, rather than face capture or the consequences of his actions before the world. Their bodies were carried outside, doused in gasoline, and burned in the Chancellery garden above, a grim and hurried final act meant to prevent Soviet forces from capturing or displaying his remains as a trophy. Just 2 days later, on May 2, 1945, German forces defending Berlin formally surrendered the city to Soviet commanders, ending one of the most brutal and consequential urban battles of the entire Second World War. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video if you're learning something new today. It truly helps this channel keep sharing these dramatic final chapters of history. The human cost of the Battle of Berlin was staggering by almost any measure. Soviet forces suffered over 300,000 casualties during the assault, an enormous toll even by the brutal standards of the Eastern Front. German military casualties are estimated in similarly staggering numbers, while tens of thousands of German civilians died during the fighting itself, from artillery bombardment, street combat, and the chaotic violence that accompanied the city's final collapse. The physical destruction of Berlin was almost total. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble and ash. Government buildings, including the very Reichstag that had once symbolized German political power, were left burned and shattered, their walls scarred with bullet holes that, remarkably, remain visible on the building even to this day, as a permanent historical scar. Just days after Berlin's fall, on May 8, 1945, Germany formally signed an unconditional surrender to the Allied powers, officially ending the war in Europe entirely. The Nazi regime that had plunged the entire continent into 6 years of devastating war and unleashed the horrors of the Holocaust upon millions of innocent victims had finally, completely collapsed. The Battle of Berlin remains one of the most dramatic and symbolically significant battles of the Second World War, marking the definitive end of Nazi Germany and the death of the man most directly responsible for one of history's greatest atrocities. It stands as a haunting final chapter to a war that had already claimed tens of millions of lives across the globe. The sheer scale of destruction inflicted upon the city, and the desperate, doomed final defense mounted by exhausted soldiers and terrified civilians alike, serves as a stark reminder of how catastrophically a regime built on conquest and hatred can ultimately consume even its own capital in flames. If you learned something today, make sure you're subscribed, hit that like button, and follow this channel for more forgotten stories from military history. And once again, let me know in the comments, what country are you watching this from tonight? I love seeing how far these stories reach across the globe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.